We have a wonderful guest, and maybe some of you already saw yesterday, Graeme Reid, who is the director, I have to say like the full title, is director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Rights Program at Human Rights Watch. And Human Rights Watch is, of course, a very important platform for our community, not only here in the West, but also active 40 different locations. You said
we work in some 100 countries, although we're present in 40 locations.
So fantastic organization that we can learn a lot from. So I asked Graeme this morning, like, if he can share a little bit, like how he works, how he makes choices, how to build collaborations and partnerships. But then we wanted to quickly go to you and those groups that are, if you can invite you to say quickly what you're working on now, the challenge, and then either formulate a question, or we can check with you, Graeme, how you've dealt with either the issue or what you recognize in your work. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of an experiment, but hopefully it gives you some great input for your work this morning. All right, but let's start with you, Graeme. Based in New York, but from South Africa originally.
That's right.
So a true cosmopolitan. Mm-hmm. How long have you done the work you're doing right now?
I've been with Human Rights Watch for 12 years now. I've always moved between academia and activism and advocacy. So my main job is with Human Rights Watch, but I also keep a foot in the door of academia, and that's what brings me here every year, is I teach on a summer course on culture, sexuality, culture, and society.
And this is one of the programs of Human Rights Watch. What does Human Rights Watch cover?
So Human Rights Watch is mainly organized around regional divisions, and that's also historically because it started as Helsinki Watch in the 70s, which was looking at the human rights dimensions of the Helsinki Accords. And then there was an America's Watch set up at the time that the US government was supporting kind of right-wing militias in Latin America. So America's Watch was set up, and then other regional divisions that came together to form Human Rights Watch. So the core of the organization is really regional, covering the globe, and then subsequently more thematic divisions were introduced. So for example, a disability rights program, which just celebrated its 10th year this year, and the LGBT rights program, which will be 20 years next year. And that doesn't seem like a very long time, but it was the first mainstream human rights organization to have a specific LGBT rights program set up, followed quickly by Amnesty International.
Yeah. And a lot of people have already talked about like how it's difficult to build partnerships when the causes are more complex, like not easy for either companies or organizations to endorse. How do you build partnerships, and also how you raise money to finance your activities?
Okay, so partnerships are at the center of our work, and that's for various reasons. So we usually use 3 criteria when choosing a project to work on. The one is that, of course, is there a serious problem that needs to be addressed? The second is there a viable group, a recognized group that we can partner with in that particular country or in that particular issue? And then thirdly, can we make a difference? Because there's some issues in which clearly an intervention from Human Rights Watch is going to make no difference at all. So it could be just a waste of resources. But the partnership aspect of it is so central for various reasons. The one is that people working in a particular country setting understand the politics of that place. So if we're working, say, for instance, in Ghana, organizations who are working in Ghana understand what the political dynamics are, what their priorities are, and we're there to support the work that they are doing based on our mandate, which is in terms of international human rights law. So there's that practical aspect in which we partner in order to do our work most effectively. in the LGBT rights dimension, there's another aspect to that, and that so often LGBT rights are seen to be a kind of foreign, and in particular a Western imposition or a Western preoccupation. So for an organization like Human Rights Watch that is often perceived to be Western or Western-based and Western-oriented, it's particularly important that we have those kinds of partnerships in which organizations working in a particular region of the world or in a particular country are taking the lead in that work. I'll give you one example, is that we did a report in Nigeria after the introduction of a particularly pernicious piece of legislation. It's called the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act, but it does so much more than prohibit same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage is not legal in Nigeria anyway, so the law is completely redundant as outlawing something that's not legal in the first place. But what the law actually does is to prohibit any support of LGBT groups or organizations, and activists there could face 10 years in prison simply for the activities that they would do in the normal course of events. So as Human Rights Watch, we knew that LGBT issues would absolutely be a closed door with the government, but the government was very interested at that time. There was a new president appointed in education issues. So we decided to time our reports. The first report that came out was a Human Rights Watch report done by the Africa Division, focusing on education. That then opened up doors with government on something of common interest, and then we timed the LGBT report to come out after that. And we didn't publicize from our side. We didn't do a press release, which we normally do, make a big splash about it, but instead the report was distributed and promoted by LGBT groups working within Nigeria, the partner organizations with whom we were working. And that was in part to dispel this perception that this was primarily an interest from outside, and to emphasize the groups within Nigeria who were directly affected by this particular piece of legislation. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's also like one of the things that when we saw each other this morning, with so many complex issues going on around the world, those strategic decisions also sometimes require to make choices. How do you allocate resources, and how do you decide on what to work on?
This is
if you can.
Yes. Look, we are very aware that there's an enormous need and we have very limited resources. The way that we make practical decisions is that we have researchers, and not many researchers. We have 4 full-time researchers, one who covers Latin America, one who covers Sub-Saharan Africa, one who covers Middle East and North Africa, and someone who works in Asia. Now, we're only able to work in this way because we work in close partnerships with other researchers who are not LGBT-focused, but who have a country expertise within Human Rights Watch. So, we work with other divisions within Human Rights Watch in order to expand our scope of work and potential impact. But what we generally do in making decisions is that the researcher responsible for a particular region, who would be in contact with groups and organizations working in that region, would know what the key priorities are in that area, and would then make proposals about specific research projects. So twice a year we meet as a group, because we're dispersed all over the world, and we make strategic decisions about which projects to work on. Generally speaking, as I mentioned previously, those are about need, the potential impact, and a possibility of deepening a partnership, but also we try to do work that would have an impact more regionally. So, for example, we worked recently in the Caribbean. We were approached by a network in the Caribbean called ICAID. ICAID is a Caribbean network who were working towards having laws in the Caribbean, colonial-era laws, repealed. The buggery laws, some of which date back to the late 1800s. And they had asked us to do a report that would demonstrate the negative effect of these laws. And often these laws are not actually enforced, but they send a tacit message that the state sanctions discrimination, and it often contributes to a climate in which violence occurs. And so our report looked at 5 different Eastern Caribbean countries, documenting the kinds of effects of these particular laws. And then that report was submitted as evidence in 5 cases that challenged the laws. And last year, 3 of those cases were heard and have all been successful: Barbados, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Barbuda and Antigua. So in those 3 instances, these laws have been repealed, and there are 2 remaining cases to be held. So there's an example of doing a report that has a regional impact rather than a very specific one. Yeah. And those are some of the difficult choices that we need to make. I would say one other thing is that that's planned research, where we anticipate what we're going to do. Yeah. But there are other instances in which there's unplanned developments, such as when there was a roundup of gay men in Chechnya, many of whom were tortured in informal facilities by security forces. We had extremely good contacts in Chechnya because we had an office, now closed, of course, but we had an office in Moscow, and the director of the Moscow office had worked for 20 years, including in Chechnya, so she had impeccable connections and a very high level of trust. So she was able to interview people who had been detained and tortured and get their testimony, because the Chechnyan authorities were denying that this had happened at all. And so it was vital to gather that information to refute what the Chechnyan authorities were saying. Yeah. And in that instance, we had to drop other planned projects and turn our attention to this particular crisis.
Does that practically mean that every time you take that agenda on and you make those decisions when you meet with your group, that you say we need to keep 20% of our buffer time available? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, yes, we have to do that, and to be nimble.
Okay. But then, given what you're working on, I cannot imagine that it's easy to say no sometimes to things that come on your desk or what you receive in your email. How did you personally learn how to feel, that you can make choices, I guess?
I think that's a very good question, and it's something that we live with all the time. Is saying yes to something also means saying no to something else, and there's enormous need, and around the world, particularly on this issue, and in fact it is intensifying in many respects. I think it's also a recognition that in order to do something effectively and well, it requires an investment of resources, and if you spread yourself too thin, that you actually render yourself ineffectual. So to bear that in mind, and then to do whatever project you've undertaken, to do it well and to do it with depth and detail in order to make it more effective, recognizing that there's a trade-off then between other work that can't be done. Mm-hmm.
It must be emotional sometimes too to make that.
Yeah. It's not easy to make those kinds of choices and decisions.
Do you ask help with that sometimes? I mean, how do you?
Well, we do. We partner with other organizations too and ensure that we don't duplicate our work. So those groups who are working also in a transnational space, like Outright Action International and Amnesty International, and also ILGA World, we share our plans for the year, for instance, to ensure that there isn't duplication and that the resources that are available are used to the maximum benefit. But even then, when I talk about those groups that work transnationally, it still doesn't meet the need that is out there in terms of the kinds of work that's required.
So, with this as context, anyone that would like... Robert here had a question, then I see one in the back. And maybe you can, as we said, share from the case that you're working on, so Graeme also understands what you were...
I had a small other question. Can you tell me something about your funding?
Oh, very important. So, Human Rights Watch doesn't take any government funding, and we also take very limited corporate funding. So we never take any funding that could be a conflict of interest or a perceived conflict of interest. So that really limits our funding pool quite significantly, and we have a very high-level vetting process of any donation that comes to the organization over a certain level. And so we rely largely on individual donations and, to a certain extent, foundations. The LGBT program gets 60% from individual donations and 40% from foundations. And we have a network of individuals for the LGBT program who give quite significantly around the world. It's called the Global Circle. There's 110 people currently, and they give at a threshold of $5,000 or above per year. And so that's our core funding comes from that particular source.
Talking about working with regional impact, and from our experience, I'm director of an organization that works on male victims of sexual violence, emphasis on gay and bisexual men. We find it very difficult to reach out to these regional transnational offices. ILGA is very difficult to contact. The EU Commission, of course, is very difficult to contact. And I just wanted to know if you had any advice, I think maybe for other people who struggle to get, on a transnational basis, recognition. How can we bring forward topics that are still not picked up by larger organizations by reaching out to you?
I guess that I don't, of course, where I'm positioned, I don't experience the same difficulty of access. And a question back to you, is your perception that this is not a priority issue for these particular groups, or is it just that groups are particularly busy on other things and are not being responsive to?
I think that there's this ideal victimization, and we work, when you look at, on an SRHR basis, if you look at sexual violence programs, they're often designated gender-based violence programs against women and girls.
Yes.
And so there's an intersectionality between our community that is just not understood. It's an oversight. And then there are obviously various mechanisms that prevent people from picking it up because it's a highly stigmatized topic.
Yes.
So it's very, it's very, very complex, but in general, it's just not seen and it's not visible. Mm-hmm. And therefore, people are not thinking about it. But when you look at the figures, we experience rates like 5 times higher than heterosexual people in sexual violence, which is just not okay.
So it's an area that's kind of unrecognized. And
Right.
I found that certainly in work on sexual violence against men and boys in conflict situations, is that there were similar dynamics of a certain level of unawareness about the issue and the extent of the issue, and also some resistance that funding and resources that is already extremely limited would be directed from women and girls into another arena, and so I've noticed that tension.
Yeah, and actually that's not always the case. We're always making gender mainstreaming.
Yes.
Campaigns, visibility campaigns. We have 10 assets of women, swap one out for a guy, and immediately you're becoming much more inclusive. It's not that difficult, and it doesn't cost you anything.
Yes.
But how do you, when you see it like an issue like that, how do you bring that attention then?
Well, in this particular instance specifically on sexual violence against men and boys, we did a project that was focusing on Syria, interviewing people who had fled mostly to Lebanon. And it was an extremely difficult project to do because of the high levels of stigma associated with the experience of violence. So we worked closely with other organizations who had more experience in that field, and published a report and drew attention to the issue through that mechanism.
So that might be an idea, right? To team up with an organization that can share the stories.
Mm-hmm. Because that's our formula, is to do the investigations and then to expose the issue, and with a view to bringing about change.
Yeah. Can you say also what case you are working on, or the challenge you're working on?
We're working about empowering the refugees in Europe and the speed networking to be quickly integrated within the new communities. My question, you say, as a Human Rights Watch, they are they have like a hard connection with the governments, and the door is already closed. So what the type of decision makers you deal with in these countries? They are groups, individuals, youth, non-profit organizations, to at least express some pressure on the government, you know. The second question is, as an organization also involved to monitoring the situation of refugees in Netherlands and the longer process that they are going through, and the kind of the interview, especially here I talk about the queer refugees who are also dealing with the hard long procedure in Netherlands, but also kind of very hard of kind of investigations and interviews and asking a lot about things. It might need help their case, you know. And here I talk about their also personal life. I think maybe you heard of this kind of stories. Yeah, thank you.
So on your first question, is that it is the case that we often work in environments or on countries in which we have very little access to the government. I mean, an example would be a report that we did in Iraq around violence from militia groups, violence and killings by militia groups of people perceived to be gender non-conforming or gay. And so in that instance, it is sometimes helpful to be a broad-based human rights organization with an LGBT component. So some of the people who work on other issues in Iraq could raise these questions about extreme forms of violence with government officials based on meetings on other issues. So that was one way of having some access to the government, but we recognize that there's going to be very little change coming from the government. So in that instance, what the organization that we were partnering with identified as a priority was to have some kind of safe houses for people who were at immediate risk, but also recognizing that you couldn't have a safe house in the traditional sense of the word, because that would mean that if that house became known, that those people who were housed there would be very vulnerable. So instead, we presented the research findings to a group of representatives from embassies in Iraq, and the German government offered to sponsor safe houses to the tune of $100,000 a year, renewable over a period of time, in which there would be a mapping of places in which people could be situated temporarily to ensure their safety on a short-term basis. So there's a kind of example of both trying to engage with the state, recognizing the limits of that, and then coming up with an alternative that would address the immediate issue, if not the long-term issue. And then we do also have a lot of work on refugees and migrants. There's a refugee and migrant program at Human Rights Watch. We are currently, and shortly, well, in November, we'll be publishing a report that looks at the experiences of African migrants seeking sanctuary in South Africa, because South Africa offers protection on the basis of sexual orientation and recognizes both gender identity and sexual orientation as grounds for seeking asylum. But the kinds of issues that they face in South Africa, largely with officials, with Home Affairs, are similar to the kinds of issues that you're describing, where people have their asylum claims denied, for example, for like not looking gay or not behaving gay. So these kinds of, and then very intrusive questions that people are asked. So our report is looking at those specific instances in which people are subject to abuse in their engagement with the system. But South Africa is an interesting example, because there we do have high-level access to the government there, and a willingness on the part of the government to bring about change. So there's more possibility there for productive engagement with the state.
Stefan.
Hi. My name is,
start with the case.
my name is Stefan. I am a drag dad to 150 plus drag queerdos. I also work for the UN, I work at the UN. And speaking of, actually piggybacking off of this, like not looking gay, right? My work at the UN is to train the people who work at the UN to understand their constant unconscious bias, right? Specifically, I work in gender bias, LGBTQIA+, as well as race, right? And having this drag brand, there are many events that I do. And so recently I had one of the people who work, well, actually a group of the folks that work at the UN come. One of them, I did this like lip sync for your life, Britney Spears. She lived, right? I took it as an example of like living your best life, whatever, posted it, immediately had a message of please take this down. I don't know how this is going to look at work. And I'm like, the fuck? This is the UN, right? Then I had a protest before that. 1,500 queers showed up. There are many people in the UN who have queer families. All of them could not show up because somehow that was going to compromise their work at the UN. And the ones that did show up had to put on bandanas and cover their faces, which was very quite strange to me. And then they had decided to do a baby care inside of the UN, which is amazing, right? But then the mothers started to have issues with the same-sex fathers, or maybe a trans person who would be in the room. Do I feel safe? Which is also very interesting conversations, right? So my question to you is, within your organization, do you do the work of continuing to check in on the unconscious biases that go within your own group of people, and if their values are really aligned with the work that they're doing? And then second, with the work that you do on the outside, often we as the people, right, we go in, we see these problems, and it usually is talking about the problems. And so one of the things also with the UN is they have a list of countries when you want to do field work that they tell you about the LGBTQ environment. And I'll use the example of Myanmar because I've been there. Actually, there's a Dutch artist who created a film festival there. Completely illegal to be gay. But the French embassy has hosted this event and often host events because when you're in the embassy, you're in that country, so it's not illegal. And even a country that has an illegal law has a gay street. And so are you also doing the work of going grassroots and empowering those communities that are in there that are doing the work versus just seeing it as like this bigger problem of the government? Because I come from America, and with all of the problems in the laws, we have communities that are thriving. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Those are both very important points. I think, like many organizations, is that in recent years, Human Rights Watch has become much more attuned to and invested much more strongly in internal processes and policies. So, I mean, and again, it's certainly not perfect, but it's made a lot of investment in striving towards a more equitable working environment. And then your question, I think there are two aspects to your second question that particularly interest me. The one is sometimes there's a tension between our mandate is really working within terms of international human rights law, and we often focus then on law and policy with the sense of the relationship between law and policy and social change. And we do, as far as possible, engage with and take the lead from organizations that are working in a particular country. So to a certain extent that moderates the way in which we work, because we are interested in what the priorities are of groups working on the ground. So, for example, a very brief example, in Vietnam, we were poised to do a project there. The group that we partnered with in Vietnam wanted us to work on bullying in schools as a priority issue. And what we found doing that research was that there was a pervasive myth that being gay or transgender was a mental illness. And so the report really focused on that aspect. And subsequent to the publication of the report, the organization there organized a petition that got some 200,000 signatories. And then we also briefed the US Special Envoy on LGBTI issues, Jessica Stern, who had a meeting with the Ministry of Health and others. She raised this issue, and the Ministry of Health issued a memorandum to say that, same-sex relations and transgender identity were not a mental health issue. So there's an example of taking what in some respects might be an unexpected approach on bullying in schools in Vietnam, but the organization there recognized that it could make traction. But the other part of your question that I find interesting is that of resilience, because so often as an organization focusing on human rights abuses, that's what we're looking at all the time. And then it's not always possible to show that sort of resilience and creativity of people's lives, notwithstanding these very difficult circumstances. So we've started to try to do more positive stories about people who are doing amazing work in very difficult circumstances, and to foreground that rather than always the association of abuse and, yeah.
It's a thing that feels tiring.
Yes.
You know? Like you just, especially if you're on the grassroots doing the work, and especially the people that I got to know that are protecting the street. Everything they hear is terrible, and they're like, we're doing this work and we're not being empowered. And
Yes.
for me, my love language is words of affirmation.
Yes.
So I was just checking in with you.
Yeah, it's also interesting in the context of building partnerships that if you're only the one always like in the complaining or the negative role, it makes it also difficult for
Very.
the partner. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Marloes. I work in politics for the Social Democrats in the Netherlands. And in response to what you mentioned about the plant research, I grew up in Zimbabwe, in Harare, and my father worked as a doctor there. And what happened with plant research is that a lot of his colleagues, they ended up having a car accident, which actually meant that Mugabe took care of them. So were imprisoned or no. And I was wondering about what I admire so much about the Human Rights Watch is that even though it gets very tough, they never end up in local political conflict and never respond with violence. So I'm wondering, how do you manage to do that even in the very tough countries?
That's a very good question. And I think that, you know, the reputation of the organization is the most valuable thing that we have. And so it's always strictly non-partisan and doesn't take political sides in any issue. It focuses only on the human rights abuses that take place in terms of the framework of international human rights law. But it also, what you're saying, raises a question about security. Not so much security of our researchers, because the researchers are in a certain sense protected, although we do have, of course, a strong security focus in the organization, but mostly our concern about people with whom we are working, and to ensure that all the security measures are in place to protect people who have collaborated with us. And there are instances in which people are subsequently targeted because of speaking with or engaging with Human Rights Watch, and then we have a responsibility to ensure their safety. And sometimes that means extracting people from a particular country and helping them find safety elsewhere. But we take enormous steps to ensure that that doesn't happen by protecting the identity of people. We do work in countries where we are not welcome and where we're not allowed to go, but we still do that. You know, we've been thrown out of Egypt. We have a sanction from China. There are countries in which it's extremely difficult to work and where we've had to extract our staff and move them to safety. We've also had to close the Moscow office and relocate our staff that had worked in the Moscow office for many years.
Well, thank you so much. Great start of the day with you. I know you're also coming back later this afternoon, so I think it's a great opportunity for any of you that might have questions still later on, or want to check in with you about some things that you're working on. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks.